All right, so let's take a look at Unit Four's notes here. Unit 4 is essentially looking at what's called political geography. And it's going to start you off with looking at what's called a state. Um, and the biggest thing that's going to catch you guys up or trip you guys up when it comes to, you know, here in the United States, we think of a state like South Carolina. Well, in the context of human geography, more specifically political geography, we're using the word state interchangeably with country and nation. Okay. So when you hear or read the word state, I guess see the word state or read it on an AP test, don't think of the word state in an American context. Think of it in the context of a country. Okay. So France as a state, or Japan as a state, or Russia as a state. Okay. So just for clarity's sake, um, just so that doesn't trip you up nearly as much. Okay. So a state is a large political unit that has a defined boundary and a permanent population. It also must be recognized by other states. The United States, we recognize roughly 195 sovereign, or better yet, independent states in the world. Remember, the word sovereign simply means you have control over your own affairs. Okay. You are able to handle your own business. If you're a sovereign state, that means you are independent and you do what's best for you. Okay. There are several states that have their sovereignty challenged on a global or local scale. Taiwan's a good example. China claims that Taiwan is a rebellious province of the mainland, but it is not independent. Since China has so much global power, most other states follow their lead and also do not recognize Taiwan as sovereign, even though they, well, are. Okay. But then that gets into the debate as to whether or not Taiwan is a state because they have a defined boundary, they have a permanent population, they do not do what China does, but, arguably, China doesn't recognize Taiwan. A lot of other countries do not recognize Taiwan. So the question becomes, is Taiwan a state based on the definition? Just something to think about there. Other political entities, what we call a nation. A nation is a group of people. Okay. This is another one. This is another word that trips people up. I'm not even going to say students, trips people up because we use the words country, nation, and state so interchangeably that they almost have the exact same meaning. A nation in reality is a group of people who are united by a shared culture, heritage, language, possibly other belief systems are shared. They usually want to have an independent territory, and a nation of people may not. We're going to talk about later on here in this unit that a nation of people may not be their own country. They may not be their own state. They might be spread out over multiple states or multiple countries. Okay. And we're going to talk about that here momentarily. Nation states are countries made up of one nationality, such as Iceland and Japan. Think of the countries that are most made up of one ethnic group. This usually implies strong immigration policies, but there can also be foreigners living there too. In Japan, for example, almost all of the people that live there are Japanese because of strict immigration policies and a strong national identity. Okay. Multinational states are countries made up of many nationalities, such as us in Canada. Okay. We are a state, often have one majority group that also has a lot of political power, but there is a diversity of nations. There is usually reflected within national languages where there either isn't one or there are multiple. Now you have what are called stateless nations. This is what I was referencing before, like the Kurds or the Palestinians in the Middle East. These are groups of people that do not have an independent homeland. All right? They do not have a place to call their own. The Palestinians, for example, they've been in conflict with the Israelis basically since 1947, when the United Nations declared that what is today Israel would be the quote unquote Jewish homeland. And they were essentially telling the Palestinians that lived in that part of the world, in that part of the Middle East, sorry, but this is now the Jewish homeland. You can live here if you want to, but just so we're clear, Israel is the Jewish state. This territory is no longer yours, or it never was yours to begin with. Okay? So, a stateless nation, the Palestinians are a great example in the Middle East. They don't have an official homeland. They don't have a territory to call their own. Okay? And here are some graphics illustrating that concept. What we call the West Bank is within the borders of Israel. So is what we call the Gaza Strip. Okay. And what these places are, these are all Palestinian territories that exist within what you and I know to be Israel. Okay. And this is what is creating, at least politically creating, a lot of the conflicts that we have seen in Israel, in this part of the world, for generations. Okay. So again, that's a great example. The Palestinians would be a great example of a stateless nation. And then what's been happening in Israel between Israelis and Palestinians for decades in terms of violence and warfare and terrorism and all that. It's a good example for that kind of a concept. Last but not least, what we call a multi-state nation. Think about the Korean Peninsula. North and South Korea, no matter how you slice it and dice it, they're still all Koreans. Okay, you have Koreans that live in China. You have certainly Koreans who live in the U.S. But an example of a multi-state nation or multi-state nations would be, again, the Koreans who live as a nation. They have two separate states, North and South Korea, and then Koreans make up I hesitate, I wouldn't say significant part of the American population, but we'll say a noticeable part of the population, especially if you're out in California. Okay. All right, 4.2 is looking at what's called the political processes. The political map has changed dramatically, even in just the last century. But for a real eye-opener, check out what the political map looked like in 1800. So that gives you an idea as to, look at the U.S. in 1800. Remember, this is going to be before the Louisiana Purchase. If this is an 1800 map, it's before 1803, which means Napoleon in France has not yet sold it to us. And all we were was this chunk of territory east of the Mississippi River, and France and Spain owned the other 2/3 of what is today the U.S. Okay, Spain owned pretty much all of what is today Mexico and Central America. They owned at least half of South America. Okay, and if you want to take a look at Africa, Asia, the Russian Empire. I have a tendency, if it's 1800, to look at North America, and you've got England, France, and Spain at that time, all kind of still jockeying for position, And excuse me, I said England. Technically, it's 1800 and it is the United States by this time. So you've got the United States, which is predominantly English ancestry at this point, okay, in terms of the European influence. But then you also have west of the Mississippi, you have France, who has laid claim to this part of North America. And oh, by the way, you still have Spain there as well. Okay. So, how do we go from what that map was to what we have now? Well, it's been a process. Okay. Arguably a messy process. As there are forces at play which can unify and break up countries and have certainly done so over the decades. The idea that nations could establish an independent country is not all that old. In the 1600s, during the Enlightenment, nationalism was first theorized. Nationalism, again, is a nation's desire to create and maintain its own state. This is the spark that leads to an independent nation state, although too much of it can also be detrimental to a state and can lead to never-ending wars. You know, when you talk about World War I, for example, one of the primary motivating factors that led to World War I was arguably excessive nationalism amongst Austrian, Hungarians, Russians, Serbians, Germans, French-speaking peoples, the British, even the Americans, arguably down the road in that war, the Italians as well. Excessive nationalism can lead to certainly conflict, as we have seen in world history. All right, so colonialism and imperialism. We mentioned these two concepts in Unit 3 briefly because we talked about diffusion of culture, we talked about diffusion of language, how religion spread, how sport and dance and dress and food spread over, over the world during the 1718, early 1900s. And again, the diffusion of culture worldwide hundreds of years ago was largely in part to these two isms. Again, colonialism and imperialism. And throughout history, the political map was vastly altered because of these two concepts. Imperialism is a more broad term that includes anytime a country is exerting any kind of mainly political, economic, or military influence over a smaller, usually less developed country. Okay? Think of 150 years ago in world history, and we're going to talk about these two concepts specifically this week in class. Think about the United States taking over the Kingdom of Hawaii. Okay? Again, Hawaii at one time was its own independent kingdom with Americans living there. American farmers were living there, and the American government just walks on in to Queen Lulu Kalani's palace and says, okay, Queen Lulu, this is ours now, okay? Or think about the United States. We defeat Spain in 1898 in the Spanish-American War, and as a result, we get Puerto Rico. We get Cuba, and then Cuba gets their independence. We get Guam. We get the Philippines. Then the Philippines fight us for their independence. In all of these cases, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, the Philippines, these are all less developed peoples. And here we are, the big bad United States, essentially walking in, taking over, saying this is ours. And we're doing so again for political, economic, and in the case of Guam, and really Hawaii and Puerto Rico, there was military motivation behind this as well. All right. When you talk about, well, why would we want Hawaii and Guam militarily? What's the strategic significance? Well, in American history, at some point you're going to talk about a U.S. admiral named Alfred Thayer Mahan. And Alfred Thayer Mahan, a U.S. admiral back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, again, this is before airplane technology. This is back when if you had a Navy, if you wanted to be the biggest, baddest bully on the block, you had to have a Navy. And Admiral Mahan basically encouraged every American president in the late early 1900s, guys like President William McKinley, guys like President Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, that we had to have, in order to be a superpower, we had to have the best Navy on the planet. Well, if you're going to have the best Navy on the planet and you're going to be a world dominator of that planet, speaking, from a Navy's perspective, you got to have ports and stations around the world. And so if you're a battleship going from California to Asia, you're going to have to fill up at some point along the way. Okay? What a great place to fill up. Hawaii. Guam, same thing, is out in the South Pacific. What a great place to build a naval station where battleships and aircraft carriers can port, can dock, can refuel, can take a break. Again, imperialism had a lot of political and economic motivation behind it, but a lot of it was military as well. Colonialism is a type of imperialism where people move into and settle on the land of another country. The Europeans began practicing this concept in the 1500s, expanded it rapidly until much of the world was colonized by the Europeans. England is the most notorious colonial European group, imperial European group. There was an old saying that the sun never set on the British Empire, because when you think about where England was at really the late 1800s, or forget that, let's just say the entire 1800s into the 1900s, there was a good time period when England, it had Australia, it had India, it had North America, it had, well, clearly itself in Europe, it had parts of Africa. And so, no matter where the sun was shining on the planet, there was a chance that it was shining on something that England controlled. Okay? And so, yeah, the saying that the sun never set on the British Empire was, for better or worse, incredibly accurate and true. Okay? Spain and Portugal are the ones who kicked things off, however, in the 1500s by establishing their empires in Central and South America for, again, religion, nationalism, and wealth. God, glory, and gold. England, France, and the Dutch soon followed, mostly colonizing different territories in North America. The early Europeans fought each other frequently for more dominance across the Americas, straight on into the 1800s. And so again, when we talk about diffusion of culture, again, imperialism and colonialism are part of that discussion. Colonialism and imperialism are also part of the discussion of how and why different countries and different boundaries came to be in places like North America, South America, Africa, Asia, the entire globe. Okay? All right, what we call the Berlin Conference in 1884, maybe even 1885, I want to say. In the 1880s, here's what basically happened. a bunch of European countries, mainly countries like Germany, Belgium, Italy, England, and France got in on the action as well. They get together in Berlin and basically take out a map of Africa and say, okay, so that we don't run the risk of fighting each other and getting in each other's way, here's what we're going to do. We're going to carve up Africa. England, you're going to get this part. Italy, you get this part of Africa. Germany, here's your slice of the pie. Belgium, here's your piece. Basically, Europe decided Africa's geographic fate for it. Okay? It is important to note that at the Berlin Conference, there was no African representation at this conference. It was a bunch of Europeans deciding what was going to happen to Africa for the betterment not of the Africans, but of the Europeans. Okay? Keep that in mind. They also paid no attention to any of the tribal or traditional histories or boundaries or relationships that had been established in Africa for generations. They simply, and again, when I say they, I mean the Europeans, simply did what was best for themselves and ignored the people who lived there. Okay? So here's a map of, here's what Africa looked like before and after the Berlin Conference. Notice how afterwards only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. Keep in mind that native Africans lived across the continent before Europeans arrived. And again, they had established their own empires, their own societies, their own culture. And if you look to the right, in 1914, right as World War I is beginning, here you have what I would call a Europeanized map of Africa. Okay? A map of Africa that has been tainted by the hands of the Europeans. Okay? And again, not for the betterments, one of those words, not for the betterment of the Africans who live there, but for the economic and political gain for the Europeans. Okay? So, oftentimes people ask the question, why can't Africa get it in gear? Why is every other continent flourishing and Africa still struggles? I'm not saying that I blame the Berlin Conference or the nations of Europe for Africa's modern day mess, but I'd be willing to point the finger, if that makes you feel better, at Europe. Okay? But that's just me. Okay? All right, world wars. Both world wars led to drastic changes in the political map. After World War I, new states were carved out of losing belligerents, including the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Germany. Rising nationalism also triggered independence in other countries at the same time, including Ireland from the UK, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania from Russia. During World War II, the rapid expansion of the Nazis and Imperial Japan changed the maps of Europe and Asia. As a result, or as soon as both powers were defeated in 1945, their short-lived empires were broken up or occupied by other states. For example, the states of Eastern Europe went from Nazi occupation to then Soviet occupation. And what's really interesting about Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe is during the Cold War, countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania and those types of countries, they were countries really just on the map or in name only, because they were countries, we in America like to refer to them as puppet states. what a puppet state during the Cold War was an Eastern European country like a Poland that was quote unquote independent, but was led by a communist government who took its orders from Moscow. Moscow being the capital of the Soviet Union of Russia at the time. Okay. In fact, the only non puppet communist government in Eastern Europe during the entire Cold War was Yugoslavia. And we're going to talk about Yugoslavia later on. But if that ever comes up, just kind of note that Yugoslavia, while it was a communist Eastern European country during the Cold War, it was not in cahoots with the Soviet Union. Okay? They did what they wanted to do as a communist country without Moscow telling them what to do. Okay? Remember, the Cold War, it runs from after World War II into the early 90s. It's a quote-unquote conflict of ideals between us and the Soviet Union. And we refer to it as a Cold War because us and the Soviets never actually engaged in traditional conventional warfare with each other. Instead, what you see during the Cold War are several what are known as proxy wars. For example, the Korean War, the war in Vietnam, the Soviet-Afghan War. You could argue what happens in Cuba in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, okay? Those are all examples of proxy conflicts or proxy wars that happened during this thing that we call the Cold War, where in Korea, Vietnam, and in Afghanistan, there was actual conventional fighting. In fact, we did most of the fighting in Korea. We did most of the fighting in Vietnam. We did not do a lot of the fighting in Afghanistan. We simply helped the group of Afghanistan rebels known as the Mujahideen fight back against the Soviet Union. I would argue that we did not involve ourselves too much in Afghanistan back in the 70s and 80s because we had just gotten out of Vietnam and it was difficult to justify. Even if it's fighting the Soviets directly, it was difficult to justify another American war just after we had gotten out of Vietnam and the fall of Saigon and all that good stuff. Okay. All right. After World War II, in the 50s and 60s, we begin to see a lot of what is called decolonization. Decolonization, for all intents and purposes, is simply when countries like England and France began to leave parts of Africa and Asia, their former colonies. Okay? We see specifically England and France during the 50s and 60s basically turn over governance of those colonies to the Africans, to the Asians that were living in those countries. In most cases, unfortunately, what happens with decolonization is, take for example, the British or the French in Africa. In fact, any European country in Africa, they basically just one day told people in Africa, hey, it's been great being your imperial rulers for all these years, but we're going to give you your independence. However, we're not going to leave you with any kind of a playbook for how to keep this thing going. And so what happens in a lot of African countries is one day things are going great. The British are there, the French are there. They're the ones running the country. Everything is quote unquote hunky dory and civilized. And the next day, the British and French basically peace out, okay, deuces, as it were, and native Africans have no idea how to run a country, okay? They have no idea how to govern, all right? And so that is also, remember, I mentioned earlier that I am more than willing to point the finger at Europe and the Berlin Conference for a lot of Africa's failings in the modern era. I'm also willing to point the finger at decolonization. Okay, not so much the fact that England and France and Europe was allowing Africans to now govern themselves, but they did nothing in the way of support to allow them to be successful after those European powers left. Okay. In some cases, like in Algeria, in, for example, Indonesia, Vietnam, these African and Asian groups fought for their independence, were victorious in getting their independence from France, from other European rulers. Okay. But what we see in the 1950s and 60s in Africa, in Asia, is what we call decolonization, where these countries, not countries, I guess, these groups of people, these nations who had been imperial colonies for decades, now are either given their independence or have to fight and earn their independence from their former European rulers. Okay? All right, post Cold War, in the 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed, which meant independence for 15 new countries in that neck of the woods. The quick shift of power was actually peaceful because the Soviets were so weakened by the costly war in Afghanistan during the 70s and 80s that they basically just couldn't put up a fight anymore. The geopolitical forces of nationalism and imperialism changed the map dramatically in the last 200 years, and both of these forces continue to affect current issues. You look at Ukraine, Ukraine becomes an independent country when the Soviet Union falls apart in 1991. Ukraine now becomes an independent country. And look what's happening now. Okay. About basically 30 years later, there are people in Moscow, in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, I'm looking at you, who want Ukraine back as the former Soviet territory that it once was. Okay. Okay, so that's 4-1 and 4-2. Let's take a look at political power and what's called territoriality. All right, first, another vocab word to understand, what we call geopolitics. This describes how geography affects politics and the relations between states. For all of human history, there is always a struggle to maintain territories, build alliances, and ultimately maintain a strong defense. It is no different than today. Let me bring that back here real quick. Sorry about that. Let me bring that right back up there. Again, when you're talking about 4.3 here, we're talking about, again, territoriality and, let me find it here, and political power. And again, geopolitics. Every state works with other states in alliances or as rivals. And again, so geopolitics is simply looking at the relationship between politics and geography, or how politics operates in certain parts of the globe. Okay. All right. Territoriality occurs when people want to control land to an extent or to exert their influence over people. It is a concept fundamental to many historical events. At its most basic level, territoriality is about who controls what, which applies to both small and large areas of land. But why do some states grow while others stay weak? There are some theories that aim to explain this. One is what's known as the organic theory. The organic theory, and again, this is trying to explain why would a country want to take over, invade and take over this other piece of land? Okay. Well, simply put, kind of like the guy who came up with this organic theory was actually a biologist and was heavily influenced by guys like Charles Darwin and the theory of natural selection. The argument here is that every state needs living room, or what is in Germany referred to as Lebensraum or Lebensraum, to survive. The strongest states would expand while the weakest states would be absorbed, and that was just the natural order of the day. Adolf Hitler prescribed to this very theory when he decides to invade places like Czechoslovakia and Austria and Poland, and basically every part of Europe that Nazi Germany invades. Hitler is basing his decision making on what is called organic theory. Okay? So if you're looking for historical context, and it sounds creepy, but this is the idea behind why some countries grow while others do not. This is one theory. Okay? Organic theory is simply one theory. Here are some others. The heartland theory states that land-based power led to domination. Whoever controlled the heartland, in this case Russia, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, would dominate the world. The author of the heartland theory, Mackinder, reasoned that this land created the perfect conditions for power. By the 1800s, transportation across the land was greatly improved and could provide quick transportation of troops. Also, there were vast natural resources, such as coal, and because it was landlocked, it was protected from naval attacks. And finally, the vastness of the land meant huge populations of people that could operate a roaring economy. In direct contrast, what we call the Rimland theory claims that whoever controlled the seas and maritime areas, coastal regions across Europe and Asia, would rule the world. The author of this Rimland theory, Spikeman, valued the seas more than Mackinder did and theorized that control of the coasts was more powerful than the heartland could ever be. So, but again, when we're talking about, why do some countries grow and others stay weak? One theory to explain that is what's called the organic theory. When talking about what's more important to world domination, controlling the land or controlling the seas, it's an interesting debate. What's more pertinent to having control over the world? Would it be to be having control over a vast stretch of land? Or would it be more important to have control over vast stretches of coastline? I don't know. I'm sure you can come up with the pros and the cons for both, as far as attacking this from a debate perspective. But again, just kind of think about or know what these two theories were at their core. Okay, the heartland theory, think of it this way: the heartland, the center of a country, the landlocked portion. Okay, the rim, the outside, the rimland theory. Okay, the coastline. Okay, here we got a map of the world, and we're looking at, again, the area known as the heartland is kind of this red shade right here. I'm assuming that's red, where Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia are. The rimland area of Europe and Asia is there in blue. Okay. And then you have these periphery islands, or periphery lands that are, according to both men, both of these two theorists here, are inconsequential, are essentially meaningless. Okay. And there's an argument here to be made for why and how the two world wars of the 20th century, happen where they happen. I mean, look at the part of the world that both Mackinder and Spikeman value. Asia and Europe, where World War I and World War II, where is the interest? Asia and Europe. Okay? Nobody's fighting over South America for some reason. Okay? And interestingly enough, people are not typically fighting over Africa, at least not sub-Saharan or Southern Africa. Okay? So that's something else to think about there when looking at these two theories, the Heartland and Rimland theories, about what parts of the world are best to conquer and dominate so as to dominate the entire world or control the world or be, we'll say, the world power. Okay? The Americas, this kind of stings, as Americans, these theories don't include us. And so that's kind of hurtful when you think about it. Okay? Territoriality is more complicated than just maps. It's easy to draw lines on a map and mark territory, but these lines are oftentimes not as well defined in real life. For example, the people may not agree with the boundaries of other states, may not recognize them. Okay? All right, 4.4 looks at defining political boundaries. There are many types of boundaries, and a given boundary can be described by more than one type. Again, hang in there and try to form mental connections to help yourself understand them rather than just memorizing them. So here are the types of boundaries. We have defined boundaries that are established by a legal document, that basically sets the boundary. Okay? You have a legal boundary. You have a defined boundary that is set by legal precedents or legal definition, legal document. Okay? What we call a delimited boundary, these are drawn on a map. Okay? Delimited boundaries, you have a defined boundary established by a legal document and then is put on a map. It's actually drawn on there. Okay? Demarcated boundaries are identified by physical objects like a wall, aka the Berlin Wall, or a sign, that says "Welcome to South Carolina," or in the case of your own home, a fence, a property line would be a defined boundary. The map of your neighborhood probably, it has all the different property lines drawn on it. And the fences, if you have a fence, would be an example of a demarcated boundary. Okay? Any boundary is also determined by either natural or geometric lines. Natural boundaries like a river, the Savannah River that separates us from Georgia would be a good example. The Mississippi River would be a good example. The Ohio River. Okay? Rivers make great natural boundaries. Okay? Mountains can do it as well. Coastlines make for great boundaries too. Okay? Geometric boundaries, these are the straight lines that are drawn by people. Okay? Again, think back to the Berlin Conference when Africa was carved up. Many of the boundaries around countries in Africa are straight because people drew them that way. Okay? They're not defined by anything physical. People just took out a map and said, here's a great place for a boundary line. Whereas political boundaries are usually clear, cultural boundaries are more fluid. Cultural boundaries are based on human traits or behaviors and don't have to be official borders. For example, one region may have more people that practice a religion than another. So as you cross in, you would start to see religious buildings or religious wear, but there was no definitive boundary for this. Okay. Um, an example of this could be Mormons in Utah. There is no definitive boundary that says now entering Mormon territory. But as you go into Utah, as you go into Salt Lake City, as you go into Provo, Utah, which is home to BYU, Brigham Young University, you're going to begin to notice, or at least get a cultural feeling, that you are in the territory of a particular religion. Okay. Economic boundaries also exist within one city. There could be a wealthy side and a poor side of town. This is sometimes really obvious. Take, for example, Greenville County. All right. Um, there isn't a there isn't necessarily a line that runs down the center of Greenville that says now entering the good side of town versus now entering the bad side of town, at least economically speaking, good and bad. That it's not a reflection of the people who live on either side. But for those of you that have ever driven up White Horse Road, you get the sense that, hey, I am in a less affluent or a less wealthy side of town. Okay. And there are some times where you might cross a street or you might cross the railroad tracks and notice, hey, I'm no longer in, or I'm now in a part of town that is economically different than the side of town I was previously in. Okay. You'll see this in some cities where if you start in kind of the urban core of the city and begin to work your way out to the suburbs, you'll begin to see, you'll be going through a rough neighborhood, then a not so rough neighborhood, then maybe a middle class neighborhood, and then an upper middle class neighborhood. And when we talk about urbanization and urban geography, that's going to circle back around. Okay? Boundaries over time. Boundaries are also classified based on when they were created. What's called an antecedent boundary. These are drawn before the cultural landscape emerged and before a large population was present, like the border between the US and Canada. What we call subsequent or ethnographic boundaries are formed based on religious, ethnic, linguistic, again, that means language, and economic differences between groups of people. For example, the boundary between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was drawn long before people were settled and reflected the religious differences between the two places. Here's a map of Ireland. So you've got the Republic of Ireland, which is the country of Ireland, the one that we mostly know, capital's Dublin. Then there's Northern Ireland, which technically belongs to what we call the UK. Remember, the UK is England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is not a part of the Republic of Ireland. Okay, it is part of instead the UK. So keep that in mind as a good example. Okay, relic boundaries like the Berlin Wall. Okay, there is no more Berlin Wall, but the old location of the wall is marked throughout the city with commemorative bricks. There are other signs where the wall used to be. West Berlin had more economic resources than East Berlin, and this did create an economic boundary that outlasted the wall. Apparently, if you go to Berlin today, even though it's been 30 plus years since the Berlin Wall came down, there is still a noticeable difference between what is today West Berlin and East Berlin. Okay. Consequential boundaries occur when boundary lines coincide with cultural boundaries. Take again Utah, for example. The concentration of Mormons in Utah creates a cultural boundary when it comes to religious buildings and norms. Mormons don't drink, so under the presence of bars, so under the presence of bars is immediately obvious within the political boundaries of the state, or the underpresence of bars, I guess. It means the lack of bars. Okay, you go into parts of Utah and you notice immediately, hey, there aren't any places to grab a drink. All right. Well, again, that's a surefire sign that you are in quote unquote Mormon territory. Superimposed boundaries are forced onto people by outside powers, like when Africa was divided by European powers. Um, Another great example of this was the experience of Native Americans in the U.S. The political boundaries of the states were superimposed on the indigenous communities despite having nothing to do with creating them. Militarized boundaries, like the 38th parallel that divides North Korea from South Korea. It's almost impossible to cross it without some kind of clearance, either militarily or political clearance. Open boundaries are where crossing can be done freely. The European Union is an example of open boundaries where citizens of any EU country can freely cross into and even work in other EU countries. Someone might live in the Netherlands but work in Antwerp, Belgium, while their kids attend school in Germany, all within less than an hour of each other. And with open boundaries, again, there's nothing that prohibits you from living, working, studying, traveling in that area. Okay. All right, 4 or 5, about halfway there. The function of political boundaries, types of boundary disputes, that is. So we've got 4. We've got definitional boundary disputes, locational disputes, we've got operational boundary disputes, and we have allocational boundary disputes, okay? And then we'll get into what is called the law of the sea, okay? Definitional boundary disputes, these are disagreements on how to interpret legal documents. For example, Chile and Argentina are separated by the physical boundary of the Andes Mountains. However, there are disputes on the southern end because they are sparsely populated and were never clearly defined. Locational disputes occur when entities have different ideas of where a boundary should be placed. An example of this, post-World War I, where the boundary between Poland and Germany was disputed. While the line was drawn in the Treaty of Versailles, there were ethnic Germans on the Polish side, which led Germany to dispute the boundary, especially as the Nazis began to expand. And again, that was part of Hitler's motivation, or his argument was not just living space for German peoples, but also that in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Austria, in other parts of Europe, there were German-speaking people who did not belong in Poland. Okay? That is actually the locational boundary dispute argument is what Putin has actually currently used a little bit of to justify invading the Ukraine. That he tried to argue that there are people in eastern Ukraine who don't want to be a part of Ukraine, but instead want to be a part of Russia. And so that he is, quote unquote, liberating those people. Okay? That's all fine and dandy until you start invading the western, northern, and southern parts of the country as well. Operational disputes involve a discrepancy about how the boundary functions. During the Syrian conflict back in 2011, refugees fled in droves to neighboring countries. This is, again, an example from Unit 2, Ravenstein's Laws of Migration. The drastic flood of people escaping the war created disputes about who would be responsible for them, a responsibility that fell on the neighboring countries that those Syrian refugees fled into. Allocational disputes involve natural resources because boundaries create an invisible wall from land to sky. This also draws a line between any resources discovered underneath the land. In 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait in the Middle East on the premise that they were drilling oil on the Iraqi side, breaking the limit of the boundary. Okay? All right, laws of the sea. The law of the sea addresses issues with states and their water boundaries. The territorial sea zone includes any water 12 miles off the coast of that country. Okay? So 12 miles off the coast of South Carolina is territorial sea zone for the U.S. Okay? That means we have jurisdiction over that 12-mile area. The continuous zone has limited sovereignty up to 24 nautical miles from the coast. So if you go out 24 nautical miles, the United States still has some sovereignty over that part of the Atlantic Ocean, or if you're in California, that part of the Pacific Ocean. The exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, is up to 200 nautical miles to explore in and extract materials from. Once you get past 200 nautical miles off of a coast, then you're in international waters. And there's a whole different set of maritime laws that we're not going to get into that deal with how to handle things in international waters and what's legal and what's illegal. Okay. They might call it the high seas. Most folks will call it international waters. Okay. And so what you see here is like this area right here, in between Hawaii and mainland United States, this is international waters. Now you have American waters. Now you have American waters. But in between, you have international waters, okay, where anything goes, as it were. All right, halfway home. Internal boundaries. We're going to talk a lot about what's called redistricting. This is a discussion of politics when it comes to voting. And so I'm going to give you the quick Cliff Notes version of redistricting. So every 10 years in this country, we do what's called a census, where we count up all the people in the country, in the states, in the counties, in the cities, in the towns, the villages. And what happens then every 10 years is the states get to decide what their congressional or voting districts are going to be. Where they're going to be is probably more appropriate. Because, as you guys may or may not know, there are 435 congressional districts in this country. Thus, we have 435 members of what is called the House of Representatives. So what happens is that we do our best to make sure that every congressional district is equal. I think right now that every congressional district is, as of the 2020 census, probably close to 800,000 people. There's going to obviously be some discrepancy there from district to district, but by and large, every congressional district is about 800,000 people today. What we call redistricting is once the census is done, we have to redraw lines based on where that population exists. Okay? And at some point, I'll remind myself this week or during the course of this unit when we talk about this topic to show you what South Carolina's congressional map looks like. Okay. But just know what redistricting is every 10 years we do a census and we have to redraw congressional lines in every state that best or better reflects how that population has changed and where that population has changed. Okay? Now, one of my favorite topics when it comes to politics, gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the process of redistricting based on very dramatic manipulations. Okay? This is when politicians, when they are redrawing the political map of their state, will draw the political districts in such a way that guarantees that their district will be of a certain voting kind of person. So, for example, if you are a Republican politician, you break out the map of South Carolina after the 2020 census, and it's now time to redraw we have 7 congressional districts in South Carolina, and you want to try to give yourself an advantage so that your district will still be mostly Republican voters. Because if your district is mostly Republican voters, that gives you, as the Republican political candidate, we're going to say a better chance at getting reelected. Okay? Now, I should point out that gerrymandering is grossly illegal. It has been declared unconstitutional. It still exists. The districts in America that have been gerrymandered, and there are some great ones out there that, again, I'll try to show you at some point this week. It's unconstitutional, gerrymandering is, but it still happens. It still takes place. Here's a current example in Louisiana. That's a great example of gerrymandering, the 6th district. You see how they redrew the lines, or they drew the lines of that district to guarantee that it remains a Republican district. Okay? Not everybody in that district votes Republican, but the vast majority do. And so if you are the Republican congressman or woman who represents that district, you're never going to have to really worry too much about getting reelected. Okay? There are some different types of gerrymandering: cracking, packing, stacking, hijacking, and kidnapping. Really, again, just remember, gerrymandering, unconstitutional, still exists. It is designed to give the political party who is currently in control an advantage to maintain that control by having them draw boundary lines that look really funny, but give them the upper hand. Okay? All right, let's see. 4-7, forms of governance. Let me take a quick break here. All right, sorry, I had to go get a quick drink. I've been talking for a while now. So, forms of governance is 4-7, and you got two basic forms of governance: federal and unitary. Federal is just like here in the U.S., where you have a federal government in Washington, D.C., and you have a state government in Columbia, South Carolina. And we even take it a step further. You have a county government here in Greenville County, and then you have a city government in Greenville, you have a city government in Malden, you have a city government in Greer, you have a city government in Simpsonville. So you guys should be pretty familiar with a federal system of government where there are things that the federal government can do, there are things the state government can do, there are things both can do, and there are times when the two will butt heads. Okay? All right, a unitary government is one where all power exists in the national government, what might also be called the central government. We see this in totalitarian states like in China, but we also see it in democratic states like in France. Okay? In these unitary systems, the central government controls nearly all of the state matters. Local governments are usually just an extension of the central government without any of their own sovereignty or own ability to do their own thing. Unitary states can be either democratic or undemocratic. Again, I mentioned China there a moment ago as an example of a unitary state that is also authoritarian, but also France is democratic, but is also a unitary state. Okay? Let's scroll on down to the shapes of states. So we got four different types of states: compact, elongated, prorupted, and perforated. We'll look at some examples of these later on in the week. A compact state is just like it sounds like. No matter where you are in that state, the distance from anywhere in that state to the middle of it is going to be about the same. Benefits of that compact shape is simply put efficiency, whether it's trade, travel, communications. Compact states benefit from efficiency because, again, no matter where you are, take for example South Carolina. Columbia, the state capital, is right in the middle. That's very efficient for the running of this state. North Carolina is the opposite. Where is North Carolina? North Carolina's capital, Raleigh. It's on the eastern part of the state. If you live in Western Carolina, like in Asheville or Hendersonville, you might not always feel like you are paid attention to by the guys and gals in Raleigh who run your state. Same thing in California. Where is California's capital? Sacramento. Where is Sacramento? It's in the northern part of the state. If you live in LA or if you live in San Diego, you might feel neglected because the people making the decisions that impact you on a state level are being made by people hours away from you. Okay? And if you look at California, it is a very, very elongated state. Okay? Travel from one end of the state to the other can be difficult. Try to drive from San Diego, California to San Francisco sometime up Interstate 5. It is an absolute nightmare to get from one end of California to the other. Okay? Prorupted states. Think of a compact state like Oklahoma that has a little panhandle. Okay? That's what we call an extension. Okay? There are going to be some inefficiencies for folks who live in that panhandle of Oklahoma. Okay? They may have limited access to other parts of the state that other members of Oklahoma don't have inefficiencies in getting to. Okay? So California is a great example. We're a great example of a compact state. California is a great example of an elongated state. Oklahoma is a great example of a prorupted state. A perforated state. We here in America don't have any examples of a perforated state, but there are some examples globally. Take, for example, the Vatican City. Vatican City is its own country, located in Rome, which is the capital city of Italy. And so when you leave the Vatican City, you're going to have to go into Italy, into Rome, as you're leaving Vatican City. You're essentially landlocked and you are dependent on the state, the country that surrounds you. Okay? All right, 4-8, what we call devolution is simply the transfer of power from one central government to many local or regional governments, like as in the fall of the Soviet Union, the central government in Moscow ceased to exist, and so all power was then transferred to Kiev in the Ukraine, or the capital city of Belarus, or the capital city of Kazakhstan, or Turkmenistan, or any territory, any territory that was part of the Soviet Union that then became its own country after the Soviet Union failed, that would be an example of devolution. Power was transferred from Moscow, where it had been in the hands of the Soviets and the Soviet leadership for decades. It was now transferred to those new countries and their capitals. Okay, what leads to devolution? Ethnic separation. Um, when a minority group inside a country is fighting for independence, that can lead to devolution. Terrorism could, create tension inside the country, which could lead to a breakup of that country or a transfer of power from the central government to that region or that local government, as it were. Um, Economic devolutionary forces can occur when regions seek control of natural resources. Irredentism, as previously mentioned, is annexation of other regions because of a shared culture or language. So again, those are things that those are forces that could lead to devolution. Okay, fragmentation of states. Devolutionary forces can eventually lead to fragmentation of the state. Autonomous regions are relative to stateless nations and are groups that have independence to manage daily governance, but not their own state. The Navajo Nation in the U.S. is an autonomous region. Subnationalists, the people of Quebec identify more as Quebecois than Canadian. Jews in Poland and Ukraine are more loyal to their religious and history than the state they live in. Balkanization. The best example of this was when the Balkan region experienced ethnic conflict and split into several states after Yugoslavia failed. Yugoslavia, when it was ruled by Marshal Tito for many decades following World War II, was a member of the non-aligned movement. It was a communist state, but as I mentioned earlier, it was not one of the Soviet Union's homeboys. After Tito died in 1980, there was years of uncertainty and unrest. The Yugoslav region included several ethnicities, including Serbs, Bosnians, Croats, Albanians, Macedonians, to just name a few. In the former Yugoslavia, there was also stark divisions between the religions of Christians who lived there and the Muslims who lived there as well. Okay, and so when you look at what happened in Yugoslavia in the 80s and 90s, it was just an absolute madhouse when it came to these different ethnic groups fighting over who got what land, who got what territory, who was going to exist where, how, and why. Okay. All right, 4-9, the short one. Challenges to sovereignty. We got to go back to Unit 1 and talk about time space compression. The rapid advancements of technology have shifted the political landscape, especially because of social media and the ease of travel. More people are connected than ever before, which means the idea of democratization is more widespread than ever before. The time space compression for social and political movements has never been this short. The transition from autocratic to democratic governments in the last few decades has been unprecedented. The fall of the Soviet Union kicked off this trend in the early 90s and resulted in the admittance of several new states to supernatural organizations. In the last decade, this wave of democratization has hit the Middle East with what has been referred to as the Arab Spring. And this is the primary reason why Beijing, China, and Pyongyang, North Korea are so restrictive when it comes to whether or not their people can have access to the internet. Because the biggest fear by the Chinese government and certainly the North Korean government is if people find out, the more that people learn that, hey, totalitarianism and dictatorships are not normal in 2022, that's going to be a threat to Kim Jong un's authority in North Korea. Because right now, the North Koreans who he governs over don't know any better. Once they find out that, hey, this is not normal, his power is gone. Okay? But that's why if you get caught using the internet in North Korea, you're a dead man. All right, we've come to the end. Centrifugal and centripetal forces. We've already talked about this in Unit 3, but it bears worth going over one more time quickly. So, I will say this about centripetal forces. Remember, centripetal forces are those things that bring a group of people together. Okay? Whether it's a language, a religion, a culture, whatever. Okay? Centripetal forces bring people together, and countries that have strong centripetal forces at play don't have a lot to worry about when it comes to their nation, their country, their state falling apart. Okay? If you have a country that is well connected via these centripetal forces, you're going to be okay. Okay? It also helps if your country is small, if your country is homogenous. That means that the people are the same ethnic group, the same religion, they all speak the same language. If they all have those same common cultural traits, then that country doesn't really run the risk of falling apart. On the flip side, if your country, like in the case of Yugoslavia, if your country has a ton of centrifugal forces at play, things that will divide your country runs the risk of falling apart, which is what happened in the 80s and 90s to what we now call the former Yugoslavia. Okay? So, I'll say this in closing for centripetal and centrifugal forces. Centripetal force is good when it comes to the future of your country. Centrifugal forces, bad when it comes to whether or not your country will be along or be around for an extended period of time. Okay? All right. That is Unit 4. That is political geography. I know that was a long time. I don't know what the runtime of this video here is yet when it's all said and done. I'll find out here in a moment. But this is one more thing, one more item that you're going to do over the next week and a half, that you're going to use over the next week and a half to help you better understand all these concepts that make up political geography. Okay.